Well, the year was 1923, and the cosmos was still small enough to measure. Imagine how comfortable that must have felt. You could go out on a dark summer night and see a big part of what people thought was the entire universe. It even had a catchy name, the Milky Way. A Harvard-trained astronomer named Harlow Shapley had recently become famous for measuring the Milky Way. And his astounding discovery was that it was 10 times bigger than everybody had thought. And for that, he became, I'm sure and other things, the most famous and popular astronomer in America, if not the world. But like most other astronomers of his time, Shapley maintained that the Milky Way was all there was to the universe. You could see it. And if you saw any of those little fuzzy places that you weren't sure what they were because they didn't look like stars, they had a name for them, nebulae, which is just a fancy word for cloud. And they said, well, those are just patches of gas and dust that never quite made it to star. Dumb. Then along came a young astronomer named Edwin Hubble. And Hubble had begun working at the Mount Wilson Observatory in Pasadena, in California, after the end of World War I. So he was a young upstart. And in 1923, he made a discovery that would change the way we see the night sky forever. He focused his studies on one of those fuzzy clouds, one of those nebulae. It even had a name, M31. And he found that far from being just a patch of dust or gas, it was another galaxy, something nobody had probably expected at all. It was made up not of the makings of a star, but of its own hundreds of millions of stars. And it was far away. It was 1 million light years away from the Milky Way. In other words, we weren't alone. Our galaxy wasn't all there was. Scientists would go on to discover, especially through a telescope named after Mr. Hubble, the Hubble Space Telescope, that there are hundreds of billions of galaxies. Last count, according to the internet, which is of course always right, is that there were like 200 billion, but then they added, that may be only half as many as they are. Who knows? The ancient prophet Isaiah would have loved Hubble's discovery. Isaiah's challenge was to dislodge our tendency to put God in a box. So Isaiah commanded them to go out into the desert. And you remember we started with this idea of transition a few weeks ago, where he says, go out into the desert and build a highway for the Lord, your God. But if you're going to do that, if you're going to go out and build a highway for the God who created all things, you have to abandon your preconceptions about God and even about his world. So in verse 12, he says these words. He asks the question, who has measured out the waters of the sea, in the hollow of his hand? Or with the breadth of his hand marked off the heavens? Who has held the dust of the earth in a basket, or weighed the mountains on the scales and the hills in a balance? You see, that's the challenge that faced those astronomers in 1923, Harlow Shapley and Edwin Hubble and others. How big is big? Find the biggest thing you know and put a number on it. Well, for Shapley, the biggest thing he knew was the Milky Way. And he established that it was 300,000 light years across instead of 30,000 light years across. And then he patted himself on the back and he said, there, I've done it. I've measured the universe. Until this young upstart, Hubble, came along and said, oh, but you know what? I found another galaxy. And then that went on to finding 2, 10, a million, a billion. Who's counting at this point? How big is big? Edwin Hubble was able to find another galaxy 1 million light years away. But his biggest discovery was that the universe is actually expanding. It's getting bigger than big. And yet even Edwin Hubble couldn't wrap his head around that. He just finally decided that it looks like it's expanding, but it can't really be doing that. And so he couldn't even figure out the bigness of what he himself was in the process of discovering. Turns out you can't ever truly measure the vastness or the intricateness of God's creation. Only the Creator knows how big his creation actually is. Now, when Israel tries to measure the creation, and when Isaiah talks to them about sort of somehow trying to put a number on how big is big. Isaiah is addressing our need to have control over our world. Why do we measure it? Just so we know? I mean, just to have a number? Or does it give us a little feeling of sort of getting our brains around it? Kind of knowing, well, that's how big it is. You know, once you decide how big something is, you store that where? In here. You've sort of put the universe in your head. You know, walk around and throw out numbers about how many stars there are, or about how bright they are, or how they function. It gives you a feeling of control. Now, the reality is, you don't have any more control than you had before, but it feels better. And I wonder if our tendency to quantify and to measure and to establish all kinds of technologies over our world, some of them wonderful, are at some level maybe giving us a false sense of sitting in the driver's seat. That's what Isaiah is addressing. He says, okay, you think you have this all figured out. How much does Mount Everest weigh? How about that whole range, the Himalaya? Oh, pick some puny mountains. Let's go to Vermont. How much does Vermont weigh? How much water is in Lake Champlain? How much water is in the Atlantic Ocean? How much water is all over the planet? Only one being knows the answer. He doesn't even bother to give us the name. He knows that we'll figure it out. But then Isaiah asks a second question that goes right to the heart of the matter, verses 13 and 14. Again, he's asking who? Who can fathom the Spirit of the Lord or instruct the Lord as his counselor? Whom did the Lord consult to enlighten him? Who taught him the right way? Who was it that taught him knowledge or showed him the path of understanding? Now you see Isaiah's moved from the creation that we can all see to the Creator, the mind, the genius, the power behind everything that we see. It's sort of like standing in front of a beautiful painting, a beautiful, complex, wonderful painting, a famous painting people have been writing about and talking about for centuries. And you stand there, and the more you analyze it, and the more you sort of try to take it apart with your mind, the more complicated you realize it is, and the more stuff's going on, the way the shapes play against each other, the way the light strikes this object, and why is this figure here, and what do you think was going on? And you look at that and you go, I could study this painting forever and never figure it out. Well, if that is impossible to do you think you have a chance of figuring out what the artist was doing? What was going on in his mind or her mind as that thing came to life? And even before a brush hit the canvas, already this fascinating thing was already bubbling up. Well, Isaiah says, look at the universe. You can't measure it. You think you can measure the mind of God? Can you fathom his mind? Can you pick apart God's reasoning process? Can you turn to God and go, you know, I think you blew it on this one, or have you ever thought about doing it this way, Lord? Now, the fact is, we do that all the time, don't we? I mean, seriously, come on. This is a relationship with another being. And we've all probably thought, need some batteries in that thing up there? We probably all thought, I wonder if my file slipped under the table, or does he have an answering machine? It must have an awful lot of messages on it. You imagine, dear Lord, and you wonder, is he just sort of working his way through it? I hope he's on today. I hope he's not still doing yesterday. Because we tend to think of God as an analogy to ourselves. And this challenge comes and says, who can measure his mind? The mind that could create all things. We can't measure the things. Who can measure the mind? So why would we want to get the measure of the mind of God? Because we desperately want to know why the world works the way it does. We desperately want to know what's next. We want to know what's around the corner. When we do, we feel in control. When we think we do, we feel in control. It's funny, watch a sporting event and just watch how many times the experts predict how it's going to turn out. And aren't we here to see how it turns out? I mean, isn't the whole point that we don't know? But oh no, everybody's got an opinion. Well, I think so-and-so is going to win. Well, I think this is going to happen. Well, I think, and on and on and on it goes. How many times are they right? I mean, come on. Nobody knows how it's going to work. But it makes us feel powerful. It makes us feel in control. It makes us feel like I can handle this. And Isaiah is challenging that. He's saying, look, you're going to face times in your life when you're not in control. When you can't predict the next thing. When you don't even know how you got where you are. That wasn't on your plan. That wasn't the way the universe was supposed to work. We measure out our little place on the planet, don't we? And we kind of know how it works, and we kind of do our budget, and we have our clothes for the winter and our clothes for the summer, and we have our activities, and we have our job, and we have everything kind of all organized, and then along comes some whirlwind that blows all that stuff around and creates havoc, and we look and we go, now what? Isaiah is saying, you can't figure this world out. It's okay to build, it's okay to have structure, it's okay to give it a shot, but you're not going to get it all under your control. And you're not going to understand the mind of God as His purposes unfold. Here's a scary thought. The most important things that God has in mind for you are on the other side of a funeral. His story for me, His story for you is bigger than this. Well, we measure, don't we? Well, the average lifespan of an American male in the United States of America. What good is that? Are you the average American male or the average American female? Does that make you, that guarantees, oh, then everybody's got to live that long or else? Or does God have a bigger plan? And you see, Isaiah is saying, why don't we go to Him and entrust our way to Him? Whether He gives us 50 years or 100 years, whether we live in Vermont or whether we live on the other side of the planet, whether the economy's up or the economy's down, instead of trying to run the show as if that would make us feel secure and kind of put us in the driver's seat, let's go build a road for Him. You see, in your desert place, you won't know what's next. There aren't any signs, there aren't any pointers. There are no ways to measure what's going on out there. Your GPS doesn't work in that place. But God is there. And so Isaiah is very carefully saying, you're going to go build that road in the desert. Leave your preconceptions behind. We're building a road where God's going to take the lead. Psalm 23, verse 3-5 says, He guides me in paths of righteousness for His name's sake. Without Him, I wouldn't find the path. I wouldn't even know there was a path. But He guides me. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. And now he switches from he to you. For you are with me. Your rod and your staff, the shepherd's implements, comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil for healing, you see. My cup overflows. All my needs are met. That doesn't happen because we go out to the desert and measure it and figure it out. It happens because we're in a place where this is not supposed to happen, and God is there, the Creator, and He says, watch what I do with empty places. Watch what I do with scary places. Watch what I do with broken places. Watch how I make brand new roads. You come out to build with me, I'll show you exactly where to put your shovel, and I'll even give you the strength to do the work. In the desert, we will desperately want to know things we can never fathom or understand. The better choice is to know the one who knows the way. What do they say? It's not what you know, who you know. And that is more true in the desert than anywhere else. It's not what you know, it's who you know. Now, for hundreds of years, Israel had anchored its entire identity in being a nation. I mean, that was the big deal. The slave people come out of Egypt and they go to the promised land and they kind of bounce around for a while with, you read the book of Judges, you're sort of like, holy smokes, how many mistakes can a group of people make? Finally, they get their king, and then that gets them on the map, and they get a capital, and they have their army and their chariots and their this and their that, and they even build a little tiny empire, and boy, that's their identity. Jerusalem is the capital, and the temple is in Jerusalem, and everything is about their little spot on the planet. And then all of that went away. All of that was wiped out. Gone. The big guys came. And for a while they held out against this empire and that empire, but finally they made enough mistakes and got Babylon angry enough, and the king Nebuchadnezzar came in and leveled the place and carted everybody of any value and worth back to Babylon. There was nothing left. How tempting then to think that the new reality was to become bigger than Babylon. All right, well then the way to make your mark in the world is to have a bigger empire than those guys. Let's just get more stuff. Let's somehow ask God to put us back in our land and give us an army and scare the daylights out of everybody else, and then we'll run the world. What's the Lord say about that kind of a plan? Well, listen to verse 15. Surely the nations are like a drop in the bucket. They are regarded as dust on the scales. He weighs the islands as though they were fine dust. Now, remember a moment ago, Isaiah was asking, who can measure the creation? Who can, with the hollow of his hand, measure the waters? I mean, we're so small, the ocean is so big, we can't do that. But he says, how about your human systems, your nations and all of their institutions and their armies and all of their power? He says, you know what? The reason you can't measure them is because they're so tiny in comparison with God. The oceans, God's creation, are vastly bigger than us. Our biggest creations are vastly tinier than what God has created. They're a drop in the bucket. And the same, he says, the nations are like dust on the scales. You don't even blow it off because it won't change the weighing operation. Nothing. No human can measure the waters of the sea, and no nation is more than a drop in the bucket. Building a road in the desert means putting our faith not in our human systems and institutions, but in the God who created all things. And when he talks about the nations, he's not just talking about groups of people that have a certain name. He's talking about how people come together and create a system. And in many ways, it's a helpful system. And we celebrate the creation of our nation today as an independent republic, free from England, with that Declaration of Independence in 1776. But Isaiah would look at our nation, the greatest nation in the world at this time, and he would say, it's all fine what you've done, but if you put that next to God, it's a drop in the bucket. Don't put your faith in the US of A. Put your faith in the God who created all things. The nations, the systems of this world will let you down. We look at our history and we can certainly see things we got right and things we got wrong. A civil war to try to rectify the horrors of slavery, and 100 years of fighting or more against discrimination in order to achieve civil rights for the people that we set free in a civil war. We're a work in progress. Goes on to say in verse 16 and 17, Lebanon, which was the nation to the north of Israel, a beautiful mountainous, forested, lush country, Lebanon is not sufficient for altar fires, all those big trees, nor its animals enough for burnt offerings. Before him all the nations are as nothing. They're regarded by him as worthless and less than nothing. He's talking here about worship. Well, what about the way we worship you, God? Doesn't that matter? Isn't that a big deal? Well, yes, if our hearts are right. But he said, you see, God says, I'm not measured by the size of your cathedrals. You're not ever going to build a worship format big enough to hold me. You're just going to be worshiping me in some minute way of grasping how great I am. You know, when our faith systems themselves become greater than our faith in him, then that system itself has become an idol. It's become a replacement for God. And there are all sorts of systems we can put our trust in. We can trust in the financial systems of this world and say, well, that's what's going to get me through. We can trust in technology and say, well, technology will solve all of human problems. We can trust in the military, or we can trust in a social justice movement. We can trust in a political party. We can trust in our own selves or our own success or our own ability to get to the top of the pile. We can put our trust in any of those systems. And Isaiah says, be careful. Because when God looks at those, he can see what we can't see, that there really isn't anything there. They can be gone just like that. In fact, the way he describes the nations of the world is the same way that he describes the idols of the pagans. In Isaiah 41:23, he says, see, they're all false. Their deeds amount to nothing. Their images are but wind and confusion. Be careful what you worship. So how are you going to measure your world? How are you going to get your head around this creation that God has put us in, including yourself, and the God who put us here? Are you going to try to wrestle the creation into a box of your expectations? Are you going to try to convince the God of the creation to finally see that you know more than he does about your life path? Are you pinning your hopes on some human system to show you the way? You see, Isaiah says there's another way, and there's a better way. Build that highway out into the middle of your desert. Go out there with nothing but a rake and a shovel. Go out there and discover that the God who made all things and the God who is holding our world together in his own mysterious way has been waiting for you. He's there. He just won't be second class in your life. He won't be the other love of your life. He won't be something that you honor or worship on a second level because your real loyalties are somewhere else. He says, leave all of that behind and put your trust in me. And that certainly does not mean abandoning the wonderful technologies in our world that provide pathways of healing. It doesn't mean abandoning the economy or abandoning our families or abandoning our nation. It just means allowing them to be in their right place. Understanding that the best we can do is just a little bit of using and implementing the ordering of God's creation. He's the one that's in charge. Let's let God show us the way that our desert road should take. Let's let him fill our cup till it overflows. He's the only one we need. I know that some of you are going through very, very difficult desert experiences right now. And the rest of us, we want you to know that we're aware of that fact. And we pray for you. And we have 4 of our ladies in chemotherapy right now, and another one probably very soon. We're not that big of a group to be having 4 or 5 of our sisters going through, a very, very serious time in their lives. And there are others of you that are going through difficulties at this time. Our challenge as a church is to go out together and build that road for God in that desert place. And to understand that the desert isn't scary when you're with him. The desert isn't a place to be avoided. It's a place where God appears with all of his goodness and his glory. He's the shepherd who carries the lambs next to his heart and gently leads the nursing ewes with their young. He's the God who loves us, who cares for us. He's the God who says, comfort my people. We're going to find that comfort in this time. The rod and the staff of the shepherd are going to comfort us. And we're going to see God's victory in ways we could never have imagined. So whatever your situation, I just want to encourage you, when you feel that need to somehow define, understand, control, put the whole situation, the whole world into a box, and God along with it, I want to dare you to think outside the box. And go right to the God who made you, who loves you, and who's walking this path with you. We bow our heads together. Our Father, I thank you that you're the God who reveals yourself in the most empty places of our world and of our lives. We need to see you in a special way. We need to know and sense you. Help us to just let go of any kind of false hope that would take us away in any way from discovering you afresh, building that new road for a new time, that new path that we will walk and you will walk with us. And Lord, I thank you that this is for each and every one of us in this place, and any person who is watching this message today, that whatever that desert place is, you do have a path through that, and you light it with your glory and your splendor, and you bring us to a place of newness and of new life. And so, Lord, we're just putting our faith in you. Help us, Lord, to at least see more of you, knowing we'll never understand everything about you until we are face to face with you in your glory. And we give you thanks in Jesus' name. Amen.